The parlor was heavy with the scent of wilted roses and polished oak, a silent witness to whispered verdicts. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows with a cold persistence, as if even nature had conspired to mirror her unease. Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, once the daughter spoken of with admiration in drawing-rooms across Sussex, now sat stiffly on a velvet settee, her gloved hands folded in her lap. At 40, her beauty was no longer the currency that commanded attention. It had been exchanged for something far less forgiving, the quiet dismissal of society. She felt every eye that lingered on her as a measurement of failure, each whispered syllable a tally of her inadequacy. Her mother, Mrs. Hawthorne, hovered nearby with the relentless tension of a woman who had spent decades carefully maintaining appearances. "Eleanor, remember your posture," she murmured, her voice betraying a brittle anxiety beneath its veneer of authority. But Eleanor's posture, perfectly erect as it was, could not mask the tremor in her fingers, nor the ache behind her ribs, where pride and humiliation waged a private war. The matronly ladies gathered for tea spoke in clipped tones, their words slicing the air like finely sharpened shears. 40 and still unmarried, one said, the syllables dripping with pity as if it were a luxury she could neither afford nor return. Another leaned closer, her perfumed breath warm against Eleanor's ear. A sacrifice, of course. The elder must go in her sister's stead. Eleanor nodded politely, an almost imperceptible gesture, though the notion curled like smoke in her chest. She had become a substitute, a vessel for family convenience rather than a woman deserving of choice. She allowed herself a brief glance toward her younger sister, Clara, radiant and unaware of the orchestration surrounding her. Clara's laughter fluttered through the parlor like sunlight through stained glass, each note a reminder of what Eleanor had been and would never be again. The comparison was cruel in its clarity. Youth, innocence, the untested grace of a woman unburdened by the weight of decades. Eleanor had once known that laughter herself, but it had been replaced by measured smiles and careful silences. Her reflection in the tall mirror across the room confirmed what her mother's whispers had long suggested. The lines on her face and the quiet gray in her hair were not markers of wisdom or dignity. They were the stamps of a woman whose chance at love had been postponed indefinitely. It was a bitter irony that the arrangement had been presented not as a consolation, but as duty. A carriage would bear her to the Duke of Ashbourne's estate, a man she had never met, yet whose reputation preceded him with the weight of inevitability. He was said to be discerning, solitary, and indifferent to the frivolities of fashion and flirtation, a man who valued substance, yet whose heart had been impervious to charm. Eleanor had heard whispers in society that he preferred youthful beauty as an accessory to his name, but perhaps, thought her mother, he might be swayed by the dignity of a woman who had endured life's relentless judgments. And so Eleanor would go, a substitute in every sense, sent forth not as a participant in love but as a placeholder, a shield for the family's younger bloom. The carriage ride was a study in solemnity. The horses' hooves struck the cobblestones with rhythmic precision, each clip-clop a measured echo of Eleanor's tightening chest. Snow began to fall, light and tentative at first, then heavier, cloaking the world in a quiet of improbable purity. The frost-laden countryside blurred past the window, a cold watercolor of bare trees and distant chimneys, and Eleanor felt the weight of solitude more acutely with each passing mile. She had imagined this journey 1,000 times, yet never with the resignation that had settled over her now. There was no thrill of anticipation, only the taut tension of survival, to arrive, to perform the expected role, to endure. Inside the carriage, the only companion was her own reflection in the polished glass, pale and alert. She traced the contours of her face with eyes sharpened by years of observation, noting how the firelight of the hearth back home had once kissed her skin with a glow now absent in the pale gray of winter. She wondered what the Duke would see, the lines etched by laughter and sorrow, the careful composure that veiled trembling, or merely the woman who had been sent in another's stead. She clutched her gloves tighter, the leather creaking faintly, as though protesting the orchestration of fate that had brought her here. Arriving at Ashborne, the estate loomed like a monolith against the storm-swept evening. Its stone turrets rose into a clouded sky, formidable and impassive, as though time itself had taken residence within its walls. Eleanor's pulse quickened, not with hope, but with the acute awareness that every step she took inside those halls would be scrutinized by eyes capable of both admiration and condemnation. The servant who opened the door offered a curt bow, his expression betraying neither warmth nor malice. Eleanor stepped across the threshold with measured grace, though her heart quivered beneath the restraint. Every footfall echoed in the grand foyer, the polished marble reflecting a woman whose destiny had been rewritten without her consent. The Duke had not yet appeared, and Eleanor had an instinctive sense that when he did, he would command the room in a manner that left no room for uncertainty. Her first impression of him would matter, for in society, the subtleties of posture, gaze, and tone were tantamount to declarations of character. Eleanor adjusted the folds of her gown, inhaled the faint scent of cedar and burning oil, and braced herself for the inevitable scrutiny. Her life had narrowed to this single crystalline moment. She must endure, she must survive, she must navigate the treacherous terrain of expectation with all the elegance she could summon. As the grand doors opened, revealing a man whose presence seemed to bend the light of the hall, Eleanor felt the first flicker of something that had been dormant for decades, an awareness that the world might not have finished with her, after all. He was composed, exacting, and yet there was a quiet power in the simplicity of his observation. He looked at her once, and his gaze lingered just long enough to unsettle, to intrigue, to hint at judgment yet unspoken. Eleanor's breath caught. She was no longer merely the elder sister, the substitute, the woman abandoned to polite neglect. For the first time that evening, she wondered if there might exist a space within the rigid architecture of society where she could be seen not as an afterthought, but as a person worthy of acknowledgment, even desire. And yet, even in that glance, there was a warning, as if the world had not yet released her from its dictates. Eleanor felt the edges of her composure fray, aware that whatever transpired next would not merely test her endurance. It might ignite a reckoning that neither she nor the Duke could foresee. As the firelight flickered across his face, a single thought crystallized with painful clarity. She had been sent as a substitute, but she was on the cusp of something far more uncertain, far more dangerous than mere duty. She stepped forward into the space between inevitability and choice, and in that step, the delicate equilibrium of her life tilted toward a horizon she had never imagined. The first evening at Ashborne unfolded beneath the hush of anticipation, the estate's candlelit halls stretching like a labyrinth of polished marble and gilt-framed portraits, each visage seeming to judge her as much as the society that had already dismissed her. Eleanor moved with careful grace, aware of the subtle shift in the air as she passed through the antechamber, where the Duke's household lingered like sentinels, polite yet scrutinizing. Footfalls echoed, a rhythmic accompaniment to the measured beating of her heart. She had expected cold civility, perhaps even quiet disdain, but the stillness that welcomed her was heavier than she had imagined. Charged, almost electric, as if the estate itself sensed the disruption she had unwittingly introduced. The Duke appeared at last, descending the grand staircase with a poise that made the carved banisters tremble beneath the weight of his authority. Ashborne was his domain, yet his presence transformed it from stone and candlelight into a living theater. Eleanor caught her first full glimpse, dark hair brushed back with exacting precision, eyes like storm-dark seas, commanding yet attentive. His gaze fell upon her with an intensity that rendered her breath shallow, and for a moment she feared the world might collapse inward under the force of his scrutiny. She, the woman sent as a substitute, felt an unexpected awareness stir within her, a delicate, almost forbidden hope that she had been seen, not for her role, but for herself. The first glance lasted only seconds, yet the ripples were immediate. Whispers among the assembled guests, a footman, a governess, distant relatives, began to unfurl like ribbons in a gale. "The Duke regards her too long," one lady murmured, a note of scandal threading her voice. "He must have designs," a gentleman countered, though his tone carried disbelief. Eleanor lowered her eyes, a practiced gesture of submission, yet beneath it a flicker of defiance glimmered. She had been trained in the art of invisibility, in fading gracefully when scrutiny threatened, yet the subtle shift in his attention awakened a courage she had not known she possessed. Later that evening, she found herself alone in the conservatory, the scent of exotic blooms mingling with the faint chill of the night air seeping through open French doors. The Duke approached silently, the sound of his boots softened by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. He offered no words at first, merely the gesture of an extended hand holding a small, exquisitely bound book. Eleanor took it with tentative fingers, noting the care with which it had been presented, the wax seal unbroken, and the embossed initials that bespoke both propriety and intimacy. "It is nothing of consequence," he said, his voice low and measured, though beneath the surface ran an undercurrent that hinted at emotion restrained yet undeniable. "Merely a collection of poems I thought you might appreciate." The words, simple as they were, struck Eleanor with the force of revelation. He had noticed her predilections, her sensibilities, even before words had been exchanged. The gift, innocent in form yet scandalous in implication, transformed the night into a landscape of possibilities she had thought barred to her. As she leafed through the pages, the words of long-dead poets seemed to echo in the quiet of the room, their rhymes entwined with a new, electric awareness of the Duke's observation. Eleanor's cheeks warmed, not merely from the firelight, but from the audacity of feeling acknowledged, chosen, in a way society had never afforded her. The scandal that would surely arise from such attention, were it to become known, did not register fully in her mind. For the first time, her thoughts were consumed with the thrill of being regarded, rather than dismissed. Yet the scrutiny of the household was unrelenting. Servants who had seen her acceptance of the book whispered in corners, conjecturing about intentions and improprieties. "He favors her over the others," a housemaid confided to a chambermaid, her tone laden with fascination and trepidation. "And at her age," the chambermaid replied, a note of incredulity cutting through the candlelit calm. Eleanor, overhearing nothing, could nonetheless feel the invisible tally of society's judgment mounting against her. Every gesture, every borrowed glance, now carried the weight of potential ruin or extraordinary elevation. Dinner that evening was a tableau of formality and subtle tension. The Duke's presence dominated, and yet he maintained a careful choreography, positioning Eleanor where she could not be ignored, yet not so central as to invite overt commentary. His gaze sought hers across the polished mahogany table with a precision that unsettled her, each meeting of eyes a tacit conversation layered in meaning. The other guests, noble and accomplished, felt the shift and responded with a mixture of curiosity, envy, and whispered alarm. A token he had given her, a gesture, innocuous yet incendiary. It was enough to tip the scales of propriety, to send ripples of intrigue through Ashborne and beyond. Eleanor's mind, disciplined by years of practiced reserve, struggled to reconcile the implications. She had been sent as a placeholder, a vessel of duty, yet here was a man whose attention suggested recognition of self, rather than obligation. She pondered the audacity of such interest. Did it honor her? Did it endanger her? The line between admiration and impropriety blurred, leaving her suspended in a state both exhilarating and perilous. She felt herself teetering on the edge of a revelation she was neither prepared to admit nor to resist. A second token arrived the following morning, a rare flower pressed in parchment, delicate and improbable, accompanied by a note in the Duke's elegant hand. "I trust this finds you unscathed by yesterday's scrutiny," it read, each word a quiet challenge, an invitation to recognize an allegiance that society could not yet name. Eleanor clutched the gift to her chest, feeling the heat of her pulse in her throat. The act was scandalous not for its extravagance, but for its intimate audacity. Attention from a man of such station, deliberate and unwavering, toward a woman considered passé by every external measure. By the day's end, she began to perceive the subtle transformations in the estate's atmosphere. Footmen, maids, and distant cousins alike cast glances she could almost feel tracing her back, measuring the unseen chemistry that had begun to crystallize in the space between her and the Duke. A ripple of anticipation, of danger, of possibility, wound through the halls. Eleanor sensed that she had crossed an invisible threshold, moving from passive acceptance of duty to a precarious engagement with desire and recognition. And yet, even as exhilaration tinged her thoughts, caution remained a shadow. To allow herself hope was to court ruin, for the Duke's favor could ignite whispers that would echo for decades, tarnishing reputations, challenging proprieties, and inviting censure. She walked the corridors with measured steps, every glance a negotiation between restraint and curiosity. She understood that her existence in Ashborne had already begun to disrupt the rigid expectations of an empire built on appearances and pedigree. As twilight descended, she found herself alone once more in the conservatory, the last vestiges of candlelight flickering against crystal panes. Outside, the garden slept beneath a frost-silvered blanket, still yet expectant. Eleanor's hand lingered on the spine of the poetry collection, her thoughts awhirl with scandal, attention, and a stirring that bordered on forbidden exhilaration. The Duke's gaze had unsettled her, yes, but it had also awakened a sensation she had long believed reserved for others, for those younger, prettier, more desirable. Tonight, she realized that she might be neither substitute nor shadow. Tonight, she might exist as herself, in a space that society had not yet sanctioned, but that the Duke had claimed with nothing more than a single, unwavering glance. And as the wind rattled the glass and the candlelight trembled across her reflection, Eleanor understood with a mixture of dread and anticipation that the game had begun, and that she was no longer merely a pawn, but a participant whose every movement would now carry consequence, desire, and peril in equal measure. Rain tapped insistently against the tall windows of the conservatory, a rhythmic percussion that echoed Eleanor's restless heartbeat. The world beyond Ashborne had dissolved into a blur of gray mist and glistening lawns, leaving only the intimate enclosure of glass, shadows, and flickering candlelight. She stood near a marble fountain, its waters whispering secrets as they spilled over carved stone, each droplet catching the flame of the hearth in tiny, fleeting flashes. The Duke emerged from the corridors as if he had been summoned by the storm itself. His presence quiet yet absolute, and Eleanor felt the familiar, unsettling pull of his gaze upon her. The air between them was thick with all that had gone unspoken. Stolen glances, subtle gifts, whispered rumors that stretched through Ashbourne's halls like tendrils of smoke. Eleanor's chest rose and fell with measured breaths, each inhalation a conscious effort to maintain composure, each exhalation a reminder that the mask she had worn for decades now threatened to crumble. The Duke approached, his footsteps muted on the marble floor, carrying a gravitas that seemed to bend the very candlelight in its path. He did not speak at first, and she did not speak either, for both understood the delicate ritual of acknowledgment that preceded words too heavy for polite company. Finally, he broke the silence with a voice low and deliberate. "You walk through these halls as if carrying the weight of the world, yet I see only what is most vital beneath the burden." Eleanor's breath caught at the poetry of his phrasing, the subtle intimacy veiled in decorum. It was not flattery, nor idle observation. It was recognition, the rare kind that pierced through the armor of cultivated restraint. She dared a glance at him, noting the slight furrow of his brow, the shadowed intensity of eyes that measured, not judged, and for the first time felt truly seen. "I have been cast in another's role for so long," she admitted, her voice trembling against her will, "that I fear I have forgotten the contours of my own desires." The words slipped free, a confession wrought not from longing but from necessity, a truth that demanded acknowledgment. Her hands, ungloved now, clutched the folds of her gown as though the fabric itself could shield her from the vulnerability she revealed. The Duke's gaze softened imperceptibly, and Eleanor perceived in that moment a depth of patience and understanding she had never known existed in a man of his station. "You have been no mere placeholder," he said, stepping closer, the faint scent of cedar and tobacco marking his presence. "It is not your role that draws attention, but the life you carry in each gesture, in each silence, in each measured word. I have watched you, not as society would, but as one watches the rare bloom that has endured winter's cruelty." Eleanor felt a tremor run through her spine. To be seen in such a way, with both honesty and restraint, was disarming. She had long believed that her age, her experience, her sacrifices had rendered her invisible. Yet here was a man whose acknowledgment threatened to redefine her existence entirely. The storm outside intensified, wind rattling the panes with insistent urgency, as though nature itself sought to undo the unspoken intensity of their meeting. Eleanor's voice, hesitant yet resolute, broke the fragile equilibrium. "Do you see me for myself, or only for what I have been forced to endure?" she asked, a quiver betraying the weight of years spent acquiescing to expectation. The Duke considered her question, his expression unreadable for a heartbeat that stretched impossibly long. Then, with a quiet decisiveness, he knelt by the fountain, the flickering candlelight catching the contours of his face in chiaroscuro. "I have seen you before the world imposed its judgments," he said, each word deliberate, measured, yet charged with a sincerity that penetrated her defenses. "I have noticed the steadiness of your gaze, the resilience in your posture, the subtle grace with which you navigate indignities that would shatter lesser spirits. You are neither consolation nor compromise. You are the rare truth I have been waiting to encounter." Eleanor's heart, long tempered by reserve and self-effacement, faltered. She had been sent as a substitute, a stand-in, a vessel for duty, yet this declaration, quiet, private, undeniable, suggested that she had awakened a recognition that society could not, and perhaps would not, permit. She lowered her eyes, trying to disguise the heat that suffused her cheeks. The confession she had carried for decades, her sense of invisibility, her resignation to a life unchosen, felt suddenly lightened, yet terrifyingly exposed. "And yet," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the storm's relentless drumming. "I am not sure I can believe it. How can one man undo the verdict of an entire society?" The Duke's hand reached toward hers, hovering just above the marble surface, a gesture both tentative and intimate, signaling that choice was now possible, though perilous. "Belief is not instantaneous," he replied, his voice low, intimate, suffused with a gravity that made her pulse quicken. "It begins in recognition, in the quiet moments where masks fall and truth endures. You have borne duty with elegance and restraint. Now allow yourself the reckoning that is overdue. Let yourself be seen." Eleanor's breath caught, the edges of fear and hope interlacing like frost on winter glass. She had been trained in invisibility, yet now she faced the choice to acknowledge the possibility of being desired for her essence, not her role. The weight of that realization pressed upon her like the storm pressing against the windows, insistent, unyielding, unavoidable. Time seemed to contract and expand in the quiet of that storm-lashed conservatory. The air was thick with unsaid words, charged glances, and the tentative dance of proximity. Eleanor felt the delicate tension between duty and desire tighten within her chest. To embrace this recognition was to defy expectation, to step beyond the boundaries of propriety, yet to ignore it was to deny a part of herself she had long abandoned. Her gaze met his, and in that instant, the subtle yet seismic shift was undeniable. She was no longer merely a participant in societal ritual. She was an agent of her own awakening, her own reckoning. A crack of thunder shook the glass panes, and Eleanor flinched, though not from fear, but from the sudden clarity of emotion that surged unbidden. The Duke's voice followed, soft yet resolute. "You fear the world's judgment, as you should, for it is relentless. Yet here, in this quiet storm, know that my recognition is absolute. You are neither substitute nor shadow. You are, in every sense that matters, yourself, and it is enough." She lowered her hands, letting the folds of her gown settle, and in that act, a subtle transformation occurred. The weight of years spent as a placeholder, the ache of sacrifices rendered invisible, began to dissipate, replaced by an awareness both frightening and exhilarating. She could exist as Eleanor Hawthorne, fully, even if society had decreed otherwise. And yet, even in the sanctity of that private confession, a note of uncertainty remained. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence of her thoughts. Desire, recognition, and the fragile promise of affection were perilously entwined with scandal, expectation, and the unforgiving eyes of a world that measured worth in youth, beauty, and convenience. Eleanor understood that this was only the beginning, that the masks had fallen, but that the consequences of their unmasking were yet to be revealed. As the candlelight flickered and shadows danced across the conservatory's walls, Eleanor felt both exhilarated and apprehensive. She had shared her truth. He had acknowledged it. The bridge between duty and desire had been crossed, though the path forward remained uncertain. Outside, the rain continued its relentless descent, a hymn to the upheaval that had begun within these walls. And as she glanced once more at the Duke, standing as both observer and participant in her awakening, Eleanor realized with a mix of fear and anticipation that she had glimpsed something forbidden and infinite, and the next choice, the next confession, would determine not only her future, but the very shape of her destiny. The morning was brittle with frost, the gardens of Ashborne glazed in a fragile sheen that sparkled beneath the pale winter sun. Eleanor's breath fogged the air as she moved through the corridors, each step deliberate, each echo measured, as though the house itself demanded vigilance. The previous night's confession had left her mind alight with possibility, yet she bore it like a fragile gift, wrapped in layers of doubt and propriety. Outside, the staff whispered in hushed tones, servants and footmen alike noting the change in the estate's atmosphere. The Duke's attentions, once subtle, now radiated as a quiet scandal, one that flared in society's imagination even as it remained invisible to most. Eleanor paused at the foot of the grand staircase, her gaze resting upon the intricate woodwork that seemed to twist and coil like the society that constrained her. She had rehearsed composure for decades, each measured smile and gentle nod a defense against ridicule and invisibility. And yet, beneath her carefully constructed demeanor, the pulse of anticipation beat insistently. Today, she knew, the world would not merely observe, it would be compelled to acknowledge the consequence of audacity. The Duke's choice, deliberate and bold, would be laid bare, and Eleanor's role as a substitute, a vessel for familial convenience, would either be cemented or obliterated. He appeared at last, emerging from the library with a gait that was both commanding and intimate. His dark eyes, stormy with purpose, found hers across the hall, and in that instant, Eleanor felt a tremor of certainty pierce her apprehension. He approached, each step deliberate, and she could see that the gravity of society's scrutiny did not sway him. His attention, unwavering, was hers alone. "Eleanor," he said, voice low but resonant, carrying the authority of both rank and intent, "the world will speak as it always does, yet I shall speak louder, and with clarity that cannot be misinterpreted." She tilted her head, a mixture of hope and apprehension playing across her features. "And what, my lord?" she murmured. "Would you have me believe, when duty and decorum bind me as surely as chains?" The question was posed in the form of inquiry, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice. She had learned restraint as survival. She had perfected invisibility as armor. Now, however, she stood poised on the precipice of recognition, and every instinct demanded both caution and courage. He extended a gloved hand, though it was more than courtesy. It was a declaration of intent. "I speak of what the heart has already recognized. I do not choose you despite your years, your experience, your history of concessions. I choose you because of them. Because they have shaped the woman before me, who stands neither diminished nor diminished by expectation, but complete in every sense that matters." Eleanor's chest constricted with emotion, a symphony of disbelief, relief, and longing swelling in her throat. The world outside, with its whispers and judgments, seemed to fall away. Here at Ashborne, only truth remained, and truth was terrifyingly beautiful. A servant's tentative knock at the door reminded them of propriety, of the world's inexorable gaze. Eleanor lowered her hand from his, yet the tremor that lingered betrayed the intensity of the private declaration. The Duke's gaze softened but did not waver, a silent assertion that the connection forged in secrecy would endure even under scrutiny. Eleanor's mind wrestled with the implications. The scandal that might arise, the censure of society, the whispered astonishment of cousins and neighbors. And yet, amidst the apprehension, a fragile hope took root, nourished by the certainty that she had been recognized, chosen, not as an accessory, not as a placeholder, but as herself. The Duke's voice cut through the quiet, deliberate, and unyielding. "I shall make it known, in due course, that my intentions are neither frivolous nor conventional. The world may recoil, may gossip, may judge, but my regard is immutable. You are neither compensation nor compromise. You are the culmination of every quality I have sought, every truth I have yearned to encounter, and I shall not be deterred by the fictions of propriety." Eleanor felt her lips part in a breathless exhale, the reality of his words settling over her like the first rays of dawn breaking through the winter's gloom. Her role as a substitute, once absolute and unyielding, had been undone by recognition and desire, two forces society had never intended her to command. The day unfolded with a tense choreography. Guests arrived, unaware of the quiet drama that had transpired behind closed doors, yet the Duke's comportment signaled change. Eleanor noticed the subtle glances cast her way, the whispered conjecture she had once imagined herself above. Where once she had sought invisibility, now she bore visibility with a mixture of trepidation and defiance. Each encounter was an assertion. She was present, recognized, and above all, chosen. The ripple of scandal was not malicious but inevitable. The acknowledgment of what had long been invisible could not remain secret. In the late afternoon, the Duke led her to the terrace overlooking the frost-tipped gardens. The sun, waning yet persistent, cast long shadows that stretched across the stone balustrade like fingers reaching for reconciliation. He took her hand in his again, a gesture now imbued with the quiet authority of a man unafraid to declare his intent. "You may yet doubt yourself, Eleanor," he said, eyes meeting hers with unflinching honesty. "The world has measured your worth by trivialities, but I measure you by essence, by courage, by the resilience that has carried you to this moment. Allow yourself to be acknowledged, and you shall see that the world's verdict is but a whisper against truth." Her throat tightened, the words she had long withheld rising to the surface. "I have lived as if duty and discretion were my only companions," she admitted, "yet you speak of recognition as though it were an inheritance long denied. How can I trust that the world will not punish the audacity of such acknowledgment?" He smiled, faint, steady, and resolute. "Let them whisper," he said, voice a gentle command. "Let them marvel. Let them doubt. Here now, we speak the truth that matters, and it shall endure. Your dignity, your worth, and your choice are yours alone, sanctioned by no one but the heart that recognizes it. Even as the words settled between them, Eleanor sensed the fragile equilibrium shifting irrevocably. Where once she had navigated the world with caution, now she stood on the precipice of action, poised to embrace acknowledgment and desire in equal measure. The Duke's attentions had transfigured her existence. No longer a mere participant in duty's dictates, she had become an agent of her own recognition, her own agency. And though society would murmur, speculate, and judge, within these walls, she was neither diminished nor deferred. As twilight deepened, casting the terrace in hues of violet and gold, Eleanor and the Duke lingered in quiet communion. The frost-crisp air carried the scent of pines and burning wood from the hearth within, a reminder of both warmth and isolation. She realized, with a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension, that the declaration she had longed for had been given, yet the path forward was still shadowed by societal expectation, family obligation, and her own lingering self-doubt. Yet in that moment, the choice was no longer abstract. She could accept acknowledgment, desire, and perhaps even love, or retreat into the shadows from which she had emerged. And as the first stars pierced the dusk, delicate and certain, Eleanor understood that the world's judgment might be relentless, yet it could no longer define her entirely. The Duke had spoken against convention, against expectation, against propriety itself, and in doing so, had offered her a recognition that society could not revoke. Her heart, long guarded, stirred with hope and trepidation alike. And though the challenges yet to come were unspoken, the promise of what had begun in whispered acknowledgment glimmered like a distant, unassailable light. For Eleanor, the revelation was intoxicating. She was no longer merely a substitute sent to preserve another's fortune or reputation. She had been chosen, not despite the weight of her years, but because of the resilience, grace, and depth forged through them. The storm of society's judgment could rage outside Ashbourne's walls, yet within, recognition, desire, and agency had taken root. And as the candlelight flickered over frost-laden terraces, Eleanor felt the delicate tension of what was possible, knowing that the final reckoning, the culmination of choice, courage, and love, was yet to arrive. The dawn was a fragile promise, the frost glinting across the gardens like a scattering of diamonds, each blade of grass adorned with the hush of winter's breath. Eleanor stood on the terrace, her gloved hands clasped before her heart caught between anticipation and dread. The house, still steeped in quiet expectation, seemed to hold its breath alongside her. Today, the declarations, the whispered scandals, the careful, stolen moments of recognition would converge, demanding acknowledgment, daring both courage and conviction. She had rehearsed composure for decades, yet now every instinct urged vulnerability, and every heartbeat pulsed with a thrill that both frightened and exhilarated. The Duke emerged from the grand doors, the silhouette of his presence filling the archway like a living shadow. He carried himself with the quiet certainty that had first unsettled her, the same unyielding gaze that had pierced through years of resignation and self-effacement. When he spoke, the world contracted into the space between them. "Eleanor," he said, voice low but carrying an undeniable weight, "the hour has come to speak what cannot remain hidden, to declare that which has been long awaited by neither convention nor circumstance, but by truth itself." Her breath caught, and for a moment she felt herself suspended, poised on the edge between fear and desire. "And if the world should refuse to understand?" she whispered, the frost of uncertainty threading her tone. The Duke's hand reached for hers, and the touch carried the promise of unshakable devotion. "Let them whisper," he replied, eyes dark with conviction. "Let them speculate. Our regard is no rumor, no ornament of circumstance. It is unassailable, undeniable, and it rests only upon the recognition of what has always been." The household gathered in tentative anticipation, servants, distant cousins, and retainers alike drawn by the subtle tension that had transformed Ashbourne into a theater of expectation. Eleanor felt their eyes, invisible yet heavy, yet her attention remained fixed upon the Duke, upon the certainty he offered, the recognition he extended. She had once moved through the world as a shadow, a substitute, an invisible placeholder. Now she was acknowledged, not as compensation, but as the fulcrum of choice, desire, and truth. The realization struck her with both wonder and apprehension. She had been sent to preserve another's fortune, yet she had become the architect of her own destiny. The Duke drew a breath, steadying himself against the weight of expectation that clung to the polished hallways and gilded portraits. "Eleanor," he began, voice resonant with the authority of one unafraid to confront society itself. "I have waited for no superficial beauty, for no convenient alignment of circumstance. I have sought the woman who endures, who observes, who carries the strength of lived experience with elegance and integrity. That woman is before me now. You are neither substitute nor shadow. You are the culmination of every quality I have sought, every truth I have longed to encounter, and I shall not, cannot, be deterred by whisper or scorn." Her hands trembled, and she lifted her gaze to meet his, unflinching. The declaration was not merely a private confession. It was a pronouncement against every expectation, every measure by which society had sought to define her. Eleanor felt her own voice rise, the timbre strong despite the tremor of emotion. "Then I shall meet you, not as a shadow, not as a substitute, but as myself. I shall meet you in acknowledgment, in recognition, and in the hope that even the harshest world cannot diminish what we have found." A ripple of astonishment passed through the gathered assembly. Whispers ignited, subtle at first, then cascading in soft waves of disbelief. The Duke's choice was unconventional, yet deliberate. He had broken the quiet tyranny of expectation with nothing more than unwavering regard, and Eleanor, for her part, embraced the audacity of recognition with courage that had been years in cultivation. She felt the surge of emotion, the undeniable thrill of being both seen and chosen, and in that moment, the shadow of substitution fell away entirely. He took her hands in his, gloved fingers interlacing with her own, the warmth of his touch a balm against decades of self-effacement. "You have endured what others would have shattered beneath," he said, his voice a sonorous promise. "You have been tested by circumstance, by expectation, by the quiet indifference of society. And yet here you stand, not diminished, not deferred, but radiant in the very qualities that make you remarkable. I choose you, Eleanor, not despite your trials, but because of them." Tears, delicate and unbidden, welled in her eyes. She had been trained in silence, in retreat, in graceful invisibility. Now she allowed herself the unguarded acknowledgment of triumph, of desire, of hope realized against the relentless insistence of social decree. The frost of years past seemed to melt in the warmth of this recognition. She stepped closer, heart pounding, and let the magnitude of the moment settle over her, a fragile, luminous truth that neither whispers nor convention could undo. The Duke's gaze held her fast, an unspoken covenant of protection and devotion. "The world may resist," he continued, voice unwavering, "but what has been recognized here, in truth and in courage, is immutable. You are not merely acknowledged, you are celebrated. Not merely chosen, you are desired. Not merely present, you are indispensable. This is the reckoning you have long awaited, and it shall endure." The assembly, sensing the gravity of the pronouncement, receded in respectful silence. Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that the choice extended beyond private recognition. It was a declaration to the world, a challenge to every rigid expectation that had bound her, that had dictated her invisibility, that had relegated her to substitution. She was no longer the elder sister, no longer a vessel for convenience. She was, in every sense, autonomous, radiant, and indispensable, the center of a story whose narrative had shifted irrevocably with courage, acknowledgment, and desire. The Duke's hand tightened around hers, an affirmation of both protection and shared destiny. Eleanor, for the first time in decades, allowed herself to lean into the certainty of recognition, the promise of choice, the exhilarating terror of being wanted for all that she had endured and all that she was. The frost-tipped garden seemed to shimmer with approval, the first birds venturing into the crisp morning air, tentative yet unwavering. The estate itself, with its polished marble and gilt portraits, seemed to pulse with the resonance of a declaration made against convention, yet perfectly in accord with truth. Eleanor's breath caught as the Duke lowered his forehead to hers, a gesture of reverence and intimacy that transcended words. "You are not my consolation, Eleanor," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You are my culmination." The words struck with the force of inevitability, a final reckoning that had been years in gestation yet crystallized in a single, luminous moment. She let herself exhale, fully, releasing decades of expectation, substitution, and quiet resignation. She was seen, she was chosen, she was wanted, and she would no longer shrink from the audacity of her own existence. The winter sun, climbing higher in the frost-glazed sky, caught the sparkle of her tears as they slid unchecked, a testament to endurance, recognition, and the delicate triumph of courage. The Duke held her firmly, yet tenderly, a balance of strength and understanding that mirrored the quiet grandeur of their union. Eleanor felt the world narrow to this single perfect point, the intersection of desire, acknowledgement, and destiny. And though the frost still clung to the gardens, though whispers of society would doubtless persist beyond these walls, Eleanor understood with a clarity that thrilled and steadied her. She was no longer a substitute, no longer a shadow, no longer bound by the quiet cruelty of expectation. She had been chosen, not despite the weight of years, but because of them. She had endured, she had recognized her own worth, and she had been claimed, irrevocably, by a man whose gaze saw not the superficial measure of society, but the immutable truth of her essence. As she looked into the Duke's eyes, the frost melting in the warmth of their shared acknowledgement, Eleanor realized that her story was no longer dictated by whispers, duty, or substitution. She was the woman who had become destiny. And beyond the walls of Ashborne, beyond the scrutiny of those who had once dismissed her, a new chapter awaited, radiant, unyielding, and wholly her own.